Welcome to another issue of Foreign Policy Digest Worldviews. I'm Olivier Kamanda, Editor-in-Chief of the Digest, and today we're joined by Congressman Chris Van Hollen from Maryland's 8th Congressional District, my hometown. Absolutely. And glad to have him here. Congressman Van Hollen sits on the Ways and Means Committee and the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. Did I get that right?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
You nailed it.
Thank you. And in the spirit of Foreign Policy Digest and our motto, Know the World You Live In, Congressman Van Hollen actually grew up all around the world. His father was a Foreign Service officer, is that correct?
Yes, he was. I was born in Karachi, Pakistan, and we lived in India, Sri Lanka, Turkey, and traveled to points in between.
So you've got a perfect example of someone who actually knows the world he lives in, not just in the course of his studies and his work as a legislator, but as someone who's traveled the world and lived in different cultures and societies. So glad to have you with us.
It's good to be with you. Thanks for having me on the show.
Great. Well, first I just wanted to ask you about some of the recent developments in Pakistan. President Obama has made it clear that he wants to provide economic and security support for the Pakistani government and their democratic efforts in sort of an effort to break up and dismantle the al-Qaeda operation on the Pakistan-Afghanistan border. And you've co-sponsored a bill, which has gotten bipartisan support to create opportunity zones in the federal administered tribal region. And I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that bill and what that legislation entails.
Sure. Well, as President Obama has said, and many of us have said for years, we have to finish the job in Afghanistan and along the Afghan-Pakistan border. After all, that was the place that the attacks of September 11th, 2001 were launched from
Right.
in Afghanistan when the al-Qaeda essentially took over and the Taliban government refused to surrender al-Qaeda.
Right.
And we took action, and we need to finish the job, because the fact of the matter is, if you look around the world, that border area remains a huge threat, not just to Pakistan and Afghanistan, but to the United States and others as well,
Right.
until we deal with that threat. So we need a military component, as the President said, but as he's also said, we need an economic part of our strategy as well as political and diplomatic. And the proposal that I've made fits into the economic component of that. The idea is to try and create more economic opportunity in these regions so that young people especially who are growing up in that environment at least have this alternative and some productive activity
Right.
and economic possibilities in their lives. And what it would do is create mini free trade zones within the designated parts of Pakistan and the designated parts of Afghanistan.
Okay.
Goods that are produced in those regions by companies that are operating within those regions would then have duty-free access to the U.S. markets, which means that they don't have full tariffs imposed on them. So the idea is to try and encourage a little economic activity.
Okay.
It's symbolically important
Right.
to demonstrate to the Pakistanis and the Afghanis that we're there not just because of the fact that we want to make sure that our security interests are protected, but that we also have a long-term interest in the stability in these countries.
Great. Well, I wanted to ask you a follow-up question about that. Given that the Pakistani government has recently announced that they're willing to instill Sharia law in the Swat region of Pakistan, there are some people who argued that that has rolled back some of the progress that we've made in the region on human rights. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about whether the economic impact from creating free trade zones is at all diminished by the sort of human rights, civil rights issue going on in the Swat region.
Sure. Well, what's happening in the Swat region is obviously a huge challenge. I mean, you've got two components of it. One is the fact that you have the Pakistani Taliban who have been sort of growing in strength over a period of time and are stronger both militarily than they were several years ago, as well as politically.
Okay.
And they have been using their influence to essentially impose a Sharia, but a particularly extreme form of Sharia in that region. I do believe it was a mistake for the Pakistani government to negotiate that so-called bargain and deal, because I think it will only embolden the Pakistani Taliban. Now, the Pakistani government says that the fact is that appeals that are made from the local courts will go through the normal Pakistani judicial system, but the Pakistani Taliban say that's not the deal. So I do think that we need to continue to provide support to the Pakistanis. If you listen to the Pakistani government, President Zardari and others, they understand that this is a threat, and they don't have all the tools necessary to deal with it. So we need to help provide them with the military tools, but also the training that goes with it. Yes, we do need to make it clear that the assistance that we give them has to be targeted to the Pakistani Taliban and not diverted to other theaters, for example, to be used in the Kashmir area. And I do believe that the current government is interested in ultimately the rule of law, and they are, unfortunately, in my view, approaching this deal with in the Swat Valley at a position of weakness, not strength. So I don't think it helps us to further weaken them or to suggest that we will not be helpful. I do think that it's fair for us to say our support will be conditioned on you're taking certain kinds of steps, but we should not make demands that they cannot meet, because at the end of the day, weakening the current government there doesn't serve our interests.
Well, thank you for clarifying that.
Sure.
Just want to switch gears and talk a little about the Middle East peace process. The administration has been a strong proponent of the two-state solution, but given the election of Benjamin Netanyahu, who comes to the government with a coalition of conservative religious groups in Israel, who have been less than supportive of a two-state solution, how does President Obama's designation of George Mitchell as a special envoy change, in your view, change the prospect for peace and a two-state solution there, given some of the realities on the ground?
Well, I think that the President's decision to appoint former Senator Mitchell as a special envoy was a very good signal to the world and people in the region. The United States was going to be engaged, fully engaged once again in trying to resuscitate the peace process and get things moving again. You have two major challenges right now, right? One is the fact that on the Palestinian side, you do not have a unified government. You've got Hamas that remains dedicated to the destruction of Israel, and then you have the Palestinian Authority that we've been dealing with and trying to strengthen, but there's no one government actor on the other side to negotiate with. In light of the recent Israeli elections, the President, Secretary Clinton, and others have made very clear that the United States supports a two-state solution, that we envision an ultimate agreement developing along those lines, and they've made that very clear. Now, the fact that the Prime Minister Netanyahu has not yet fully embraced that idea is obviously causing some degree of diplomatic uncomfortableness, and they're going to have to work that out. My hope is that the Prime Minister Netanyahu will move in the direction of what has been the policy of the Israeli government, in fact, the very strongly declared policy of the Israeli government, that we would develop an agreement along a two-state solution.
Well, one more question for you. Given that today is Earth Day and Foreign Policy Digest recently published an issue on climate change, I wanted to ask you a bit about a bill that you sponsored, the Cap and Dividend Act. And actually, well, that is a segue to my question. Given that there is so much going on in D.C. In terms of trying to improve climate change or lead with new policies with regards to climate change, what is it about your bill that you believe is most efficient and most likely to be implemented or actionable in the coming years?
Well, I think the United States needs to begin to lead by example. I mean, we've been real laggards in this issue, in this area, for the last 8 years. We had folks in charge, many of whom denied the fact that you even had a phenomenon of global climate change. So the United States needs to catch up in this area. I do hope we'll pass some form of comprehensive climate change, energy legislation, cap and trade, cap and dividend, which is the proposal we've made in the coming years. There's a lot of attention trying to get it done now. Whether that happens or not is too early to tell. But the proposal, and again, so my priority is to get it through. If we can accomplish the purposes However we get there is okay with me. The reason I submitted my proposal, though, is because I think it is a good way to get there, because one of the key issues with the whole question of climate change legislation is you've got to put a price on carbon fuels. The whole notion is to give consumers an incentive not to use carbon-based fuels going into the future. How do you do that? You make carbon-based fuels relatively more expensive than other kinds of fuels that are generated through solar power or wind energy or whatever clean fuel so that you may have. But by increasing the price of carbon fuel, that does have an impact on the consumer. That could obviously impact the cost to the consumer. So the proposal that I've made, is to say, okay, we're going to take whatever funds that are raised through the selling of these carbon permits, and we're going to return all the money to the consumer. In fact, every consumer who has a Social Security number will get a dividend once a month, and that money will help that consumer pay for any additional costs that he or she may incur as a result of increasing the price of carbon. So you get the benefit of making clean fuels relatively cheaper through putting price on carbon, but you try to hold the consumer harmless when it comes to the pocketbook.
Okay. Well, great. Well, Congressman Van Hollen, thank you very much for taking some time to share your views and your legislative expertise with us, and hope to have it back soon.
It's good to be with you.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.